Thank you very much for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So, hi, I'm Andrew. It's wonderful to be here with you all today in Athens. And as was mentioned, I lead our solution consulting team here at Similarweb. So, my job in nature is global. So, I'm here to talk to you about holiday shopping from a global perspective. So, from Black Friday to the busy festive season, something that I'm sure is creeping up on a lot of your to-do lists. So, yes, let's get started. So, what are we going to cover today? First, we'll take a look into the macro forces impacting the e-commerce landscape. We'll then dig into how consumers approach the holiday season. And then finally, we'll take a look back at some previous years and the strategic levers brands and retailers can use for the upcoming season. So before we dive into the data, let me introduce who we are as Similarweb. I've spoken to a few people today who actually use our platform, but many of you may not know. So Similarweb is one of the world's leading digital intelligence solutions. It allows our clients to deeply understand their market and act both tactically and strategically using our data. So what we do is we turn billions of digital data signals across websites, apps, search, and marketplaces into actionable insights at scale. And we do this in over 190 countries. And, when I say scale, look at some of the numbers up there on screen. We're capturing data from over 100 million websites, 8 million apps, 6 billion keywords, and that extends across retailers and over 250 million product SKUs as well. So what we do is we help brands and retailers, marketers and analysts make sense of their market. And some of the toughest questions that are posed in e-commerce today: where is demand shifting? Which competitors are gaining ground? What's driving performance? What's not? And personally, I joined Similarweb because of the data. I've spent the last 10 years of my career in big market research firms like Ipsos and Kantar, and it was the power of this behavioural data that really drew me to Similarweb. So next up, I want to start with this sort of data story for you by taking a look at the current economic situation. Last year, inflation was the dominant headline. Households across Europe focus on, getting through the month and not splurging during the holiday season. Fast forward to 2025, and we're seeing a slightly different picture. Yes, inflation rates are down across many key markets and have continued that downward trend that began in the late 2024. But for consumers, that should be good news, and for everyone in this room, it should be good news. More appetite to spend, right? So it'd be reasonable to expect a shift in behaviour, more confident spending. But before we all celebrate this rebound, it's really important to zoom out. Just as inflation eases, we're seeing new trade dynamics emerging. So, the recent US tariff hikes as an example being one, and this has resulted in shoppers being more cautious. They've been conditioned by this uncertainty. And, brands and retailers really need to adjust accordingly. So, that said, easing inflation does create opportunity, but only for those with the agility and the ability to monitor that change and adapt in real time. So, much like the current tariff announcements, e-commerce today is evolving at a really, really rapid rate, and the industry sits at this intersection of macro forces that are going on at a global scale. Things like inflation anxiety remain, geopolitical disruption, AI innovation, and a fragmented online landscape. And yet, the winners are those who can translate this chaos into clarity. So, what do I mean by a fragmented landscape? Well, we mentioned how quickly all of this is evolving. So, let's take a look at my home country where I've flown from today, the UK, and the most recent month of April. So this is just April 2025. There are over 1 billion visits to e-commerce sites, and we've observed over 177,000 active e-commerce websites in that month. 84% of the visits to these sites are held by the top 1% of players. And despite that, less than 4% of consumers only visit one site in the industry in a session. So they're cross-browsing. Now, in other words, it's never been easier to launch a store, but it's never been harder to sustain traffic, to win visibility, to defend share. And competition in the long tail of these sites is fierce. With the AI revolution, the barrier to entry is lower than ever. So, I've seen a number of AI presentations and people talking about AI here today, and, with generative AI tools, it's easier than ever to create a website, create a product page, launch on TikTok, create ads, and look like a legitimate competitor pretty much overnight. So, if you're a brand trying to plan your next big holiday push, you're not just fighting legacy competitors, you're fighting algorithms, you're fighting resellers and emerging players that you've perhaps never even heard of. So we've seen how fragmented the commerce landscape can be, fueled by these low barriers to entry and AI-powered scale. But it's a market that is overcrowded, it's fiercely competitive, but it's not just local either. While many brands and retailers are really struggling in this fragmented terrain, there is a new class of competitor that's emerging. And they're not just surviving, they're thriving and they're scaling at pace. So, Chinese retailers have seen a significant shift in demand over the last 2 years. While domestic websites within China have steadily declined, international interest has surged. Website visits from global markets, excluding China, rose an impressive 27%, reaching a peak of nearly 2.9 billion visits in March alone. So, this demand is surging in both emerging and developed markets. So, this includes Europe, and we can see here Portugal as an example, with 38% growth in visits to Chinese retailers versus the same period. And, specifically, where are they going? This is interesting because, the big players are there, the Temus, the AliExpresses, who are creating regional sites to compete with local e-commerce businesses. So, it's also interesting, Let me go back. So it's also interesting to see some of the smaller, more category-specific brands as well within here, who are growing year on year, even faster than the huge marketplaces. So you'll see some of those like Anchor on the top right up there, and Honor, who are growing very, very fast year on year within international markets. Now, this isn't all doom and gloom. So, what does all of that global context mean for holiday shopping? Let's take a look back at some of the previous years and explore how consumers might approach the holidays in 2025. So to do that, we're going to look at some of the consumer outlook and demand. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is the balance between celebration and spending. If we do see the recent tariffs result in upward price pressure, it may not significantly dampen consumer activity this holiday season. Look at 2024. Many consumers were navigating financial challenges then. We spoke about inflation, but remained eager to fully embrace festive spending, with more people planning to shop compared with the previous year, despite inflation. So that is a positive outlook for 2025. That said, while intent to purchase increased, many planned to spend less than they had in the previous year. So this was more common in older generations than young generations. And, in this context, it's really important that brands and retailers stay attuned to these shifting market signals in the months ahead of the holiday period. Carefully balancing pricing points with consumer aspirations. So, what does that mean for Black Friday specifically? I want to talk a little bit about Black Friday and the importance of this event. Again, we look at historical data to help us see what's going to happen within 2025, the Black Friday period, consumers were looking to take advantage of retail deals during this period, and planned participation increasing compared with the previous period, and you can see that on the chart at the top there. And when we actually dig into the web visits here and look on the year-on-year growth, and this is specifically looking at the fashion industry as an example, many retail industries actually saw a decline in holiday traffic. So over the Christmas period, there was lower traffic than there was the previous year. However, when we looked at the Cyber 5 period, this told a completely different story. So, visits were rising as, shoppers strategically timed their purchases to align with peak promotional moments. So what they were doing was they were going to spend money at Christmas and during the holiday period, but they were doing it well before, during the Cyber 5 period. And, if we do see some of those economic conditions worsen, a similar pattern is likely to emerge. Consumers will become more value conscious and they'll look for those key sales windows to stretch their budgets. So, again, for brands and for retailers, the importance of smart promotional timing and clear value messaging cannot be underestimated. So, what I want to talk about now is the period of evaluation and then purchase. So how long does that consumer evaluation phase last before they go in and purchase something? Well, in the research that we've done, consumers typically begin researching their products around 2 weeks before they start buying. With category page views, and this is looking at Amazon as an example, category page views peak approximately 14 days in advance. And, the research activity from consumers accelerates in early November. And, like I mentioned on the previous slide, this is to secure key purchases before December. They want to ensure that they've got the products that they want and they're avoiding the pressure of that last minute shopping. Now, that said, not all of the categories here perform the same. So, for example, with fashion, both browsing and buying peak together. They're a lot closer on this chart, indicating that, the decisions from the consumer are more instinctive. It's fashion, it's led by style, right? In contrast, if we look at consumer electronics, purchase activity peaks much closer to Black Friday. So, that reflects how when consumers are buying electronics, they're holding out for discounts. So, those are typically reserved for those higher ticket items that are on during the event. So, that was a little bit about, consumer demand and outlook, but now what I want to dig into is, the natural question once we understand the outlook is how do brands and how do retailers respond to this? So what I want to look at here is a few strategic levers based on success stories from last holiday period that you guys can use during the season this year. So the first lever that I want to introduce you to is this concept of utilizing early year sales events to predict holiday performance. So, if you're a brand or you're a retailer and you're looking to maximize performance during the holiday season, this powerful trend can be a great strategic leader. As you'll see up here, top performing products in October to December are often the same ones that experience sharp sales lifts in earlier discounting events. So, like Prime Day as an example. So you can use these early sales surges as a predictive signal for holiday demand. Now, this gives and provides the opportunity to adjust inventory, marketing, promotions, and, sales events like Prime Day serve as a valuable test bed. Think of it as a way to test and to fix and to alter. And spotting products early that are likely to succeed in Q4. Now, this is evident. Let's take a look at these two particular products here. These are in very different categories, very different regions, but they both showed that significant Prime Day growth and the subsequent lift in Q4. So again, this data can be really, really valuable in early signal detecting. So the next example of focus is about focusing the strategy on demand and not just excess stock. So, to bring this to life, I'm going to use an example from last Friday where the Dyson Airwrap delivered really strong holiday sales on Amazon. How did it do this? It was fueled by existing consumer demand rather than by significant discounting. And what I mean by that is, you'll see up here that, and leading up until this moment, interest had been steadily climbing in this particular product. And then what we saw just before Black Friday was a drop-off. Sales dipped in most weeks before the event, and this was a sign that shoppers were holding off for a potential deal. Now, what that allowed the brand to do was, yes, have a Black Friday promotion, and this served as the trigger rather than the driver. So it was a modest 2% drop in the average listing price for this particular product because they knew that the demand was already there. And ultimately, this resulted in an 11% increase in revenue. So, what this really highlights is that, the demand was there and the discount, small, simply activated it. So, the next thing I've kind of discussed how cautious the market potentially will be this holiday season. The one that we have on our hands at the moment. So, shoppers will be aiming to stretch their budgets further. They'll focus on value and they'll focus on essential purchases. For brands, this really underlines the importance of price-accessible products that are still delivering quality and trust. Success really now lies in offering products that meet real needs without that premium price tag. All consumers are going to be trying to make their euro go further. So, as you'll see here, these brands within the beauty category from last year, the two premium mid-market brands outperformed the luxury brands in both units sold and revenue year on year. So what this kind of tells us is that, customers are increasingly looking beyond brand names. They're relying instead on social media, reviews, and real user opinions. And brands can really use this to their advantage. Offer products with a premium look, but have real results and strong consumer sentiment. Now, they're positioning themselves as high quality, yet affordable alternatives to pricier options is a key to standing out. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you is an example and a story from Sony that brings this to life. Now, this story from Sony's success last year shows that price sensitivity doesn't mean shoppers aren't willing to spend. Again, they just want their money to go further. And this is where brand strategy matters. So, Sony's performance in 2024 is a real standout example of how aspiration, when paired with well-positioned alternatives, can be a really winning formula. So, Sony aren't just relying on one product. Instead, they give consumers a variety of options to cater to all. So what Sony did here, which was really interesting, they anchored its personal audio range in high demand, premium models. You can see those in the green up here. Using them to elevate its overall positioning and capture high intent shoppers. It didn't stop there though. Sony had this supporting cast of lower tier models, and what this did is it helped Sony bring them in, but also reach a more price-conscious consumer without diluting that premium feel. And the result of this was Sony saw widespread growth across the range, so in both the premium and the lower value products. And I think, for other brands looking at this example, for me the takeaway is clear. Flagship SKUs aren't just about prestige, they're a conversion engine, but only when paired with accessible options. So, a lot that I've been through there quite quickly. So to summarise, in a season that's shaped by caution, the winners will be those who act early, stay agile, and back every single move with data. So, a final message from me. I want to thank you all for your time. I appreciate we only kind of had 30 minutes today, but there is a full holiday shopping planning report available by scanning this QR code. I'll be around for the rest of the day, as will my colleague Ina over here, so feel free to come over to us. We're happy to show you some live data in your market, for your competitors, so please do come say hi to us, and just want to thank you all again.